Headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Let's go over to the head of Young Voices UK, Jason Reed. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Kevin.
Now, get yourself a handkerchief ready because you might get a bit emotionally overcome. I'm going to read to you Gary Lineker's important tweet today. I know these are scary times for other reasons, but for crying out loud, we need to act now on climate change to avoid catastrophe. This was in response to a UN report snappily called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it says that unless we act right now, we are in serious trouble. So they're not interested in Ukraine, the clear and present problem for the world right now. They are still sticking to climate change. It is this kind of luxury middle-class thinking that makes people like Putin think the West is ripe for the taking, isn't it?
It is absolutely incredible that people like Gary Lineker are speculating about what might or might not happen with the climate 40, 50, 60 years down the line when there is such a real emergency humanitarian disaster going on in Ukraine right now. We've seen so much footage, so many photos of apartment blocks where civilians live, reduced to rubble, destroyed and brought down into nothing. And yet Gary Lineker thinks that we should be talking about wind farms and solar panels and presumably reusable bamboo toilet paper. I mean, give me a break. It's just ridiculous virtue signaling. It's so self-absorbed. And crucially, it doesn't help anyone but Gary Lineker. He's doing this for himself. He's doing it for attention. He's doing it to look good because, frankly, he doesn't care about what happens to anyone else.
It does bring into sharp focus the definition of the word emergency. I'll hand it to the climate change nuts that one of their cleverest moves was to add the word emergency to climate change. So it gave the whole thing a sense of tremendous urgency. It isn't an emergency. Even they concede if anything terrible even begins to happen, it'll take at least 10 years. I've never heard of an emergency that happens 10 years hence. So it was a clever move by them. But now we have a serious emergency in Ukraine. You realise that the climate change enthusiasts' usage of the word emergency is linguistic inaccuracy. Ukraine is an emergency. Whether or not the global warming takes effect is not an emergency. Do you see what I'm saying?
It's clear that climate change is a real issue that we need to do more about, but it is also clear that it's not an emergency. And this kind of alarmist rhetoric doesn't help anyone. They want us to believe that the world is going to explode into a big fireball within the next few years, and we need to be worried about that. As it happens, in the past few days, the chance of the world exploding into a big fireball has gone up. But that's nothing to do with climate change. That's because of the risk of nuclear war with a despotic madman with his finger on the big red button.
There is that. There is that. You're absolutely right. All this, we need to act now to avoid catastrophe. And maybe after that we can take a look at what Vladimir Putin's up to, bombing the hell out of innocent people in Ukraine. It does defy belief. The climate change lobby is leading the world into more and more absurd decisions. Look at Germany. It had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the West's bid to thwart Vladimir Putin because it gets 98% of its gas from Russia. Yeah, we get 3%. So these are ridiculous decisions that have been made. And the one I want to talk about right now in terms of the climate change emergency and how we could help it, we could start fracking right now because we've got 100 years worth of shale gas beneath our soil here in Britain. Instead, we've closed all the mines down, and rather than leave at least the possibility open for us to resume fracking at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, as people's gas bills, energy bills soar into the thousands of pounds every year, instead of making at least the decision to keep them potentially open, they are under instructions from our brilliant government to fill in the mine shafts with concrete. What kind of insanity is that?
despite whatever the virtue signaling celebrities might say, we are years and years away, if it ever happens, from being able to rely on renewable energy. And so the choice we face right now is not between Russian gas and some organic, peaceful nuclear energy future. The choice we face is between Russian gas and British gas. And it's absolutely bonkers that we are not using the gas that we have literally underneath our feet to offset the energy crisis, if nothing else, with the cost of living crisis. Of course, Gary Lineker isn't interested in that, because if energy prices go up and your utility bills go up, Gary Lineker earns £2 million a year. He won't care if his utility bills go up a little bit. But the struggling single mother who is trying to feed a family of four, trying to make ends meet, will care very much when her utility bills go up. And so it's exactly as you say, it's a luxury, middle class, liberal metropolitan elite bubble that these celebrities live in. And it's only possible when you live in that privileged bubble to have this kind of simplistic view of the world and to do this virtue signaling on Twitter and then have your legion of fans tell you how brave you are and how important it all is without any resemblance of what's actually going on in the real world.
What exactly is the worth of a eco-green paradise when it plunges millions of people into abject poverty? Now, one of the things that Boris Johnson has been saying, I mean, my point here, Jason, is I think some of these politicians, these eco-virtue signalling politicians, actually convince themselves that there's any sense at all in what they say. As you quite rightly say, the idea that we're going to get to carbon net zero by 2050 is just a fantasy. It's not going to happen. And by the time we get to about 2035, no one will care anymore. Boris Johnson will be dead. You know, it's a stupid thing to commit this country to, because it's not going to happen. But he does believe renewables are the future, even though they never can be in this country. We'll never be able to power this country through sun power and wind power because we don't have the right weather for it. He actually said that he wanted to help the East, the countries surrounding Russia and Ukraine, from Russian aggression and from their dependence on Russian gas, by teaching them all about how wonderful renewables can be for them, how that will free them from the shackles of Russian gas. It won't. I mean, they have even less sunshine in those countries than they do here. It's an absolute madness that these politicians are gripped by.
You're absolutely right. There is no sense, there is no logic in this kind of virtue signaling and leftist lobbying on environmental issues. And even if a literal war breaking out in Europe isn't enough to convince the likes of Gary Lineker that they might need to rethink their position, then nothing will be. I would like to see Gary Lineker go on the ground in Ukraine and speak to a mother who's just lost her son fighting against Russian invaders and tell her, don't worry, we're going to put a windmill in your back garden and we'll fit a heat pump so that you can reduce your carbon footprint, and see what she has to say about that. He's just completely out of touch with reality, as they all are.
But the one small semblance of reality in Boris Johnson's life is that ever since he's been in big trouble, and we're going back to November with the Owen Paterson saga, followed, of course, by Partygate, he's been in a world of trouble for, what is it now, 3 months getting on. And ever since he first got into trouble with Owen Paterson, he's never once mentioned his green dream. Funny that, isn't it?
It is interesting, isn't it? It seems that Boris Johnson on some level does at least acknowledge the costs, or does acknowledge how wildly unpopular this kind of drive for a costly green agenda is, when it will, the costs of that will, of course, long outlive him. They will long outlive the Conservative Party at the rate he's going at the moment. But when it's convenient and when there is enough pressure from the Twitter celebrities and the woke lobby and so on, and when COP26 is happening, then suddenly he's all for the green talking points, and he's all for distracting from his own personal political problems, his own career, with the environmental issue that he can just point to and say, look at that, we need to tackle that big beast over there. But when things actually become real, and when it actually comes down to the existential crisis of of his career, or it comes down to war in Ukraine, then suddenly he acknowledges that it's not as urgent as he was pretending it was. It's not as urgent as Gary Lineker is pretending it is, and there are much more real issues we need to be dealing with.
To summarise, it's not an emergency, but do you think, Jason, and this is why I wanted to do this story, we're going to do a story about wokery in a minute. I just think that people like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in Beijing, they look to us and they think, look at those idiots, look what they're doing with their energy policies, while we go, oh, carbon net zero, heat pumps for all, oh, get insulated. Xi Jinping has got 1,082 coal-fueled power stations and he's building 300 more. Same kind of deal in Russia. They're full of coal-fueled power stations, and they could give a damn, a rat's backside about climate change, and they're laughing at us because of our policies. You get very cheap energy, by the way, in Russia and China for those very reasons.
Exactly right. They are laughing at us. They think it's ridiculous. They didn't attend COP26. They haven't made net zero commitments, and they're much, much bigger polluters and emitters than we are. We had that huge scandal last year over one single coal plant in the northeast of England, and meanwhile, China is opening 1,000 new ones every 5 minutes, and it doesn't make the front pages of the newspapers, and nobody cares because it fuels their industry and it fuels their economy, makes them richer and more powerful. And meanwhile, we're fretting over, plastic straws and issues that don't affect anyone and won't have any real impact on the world.
Indulging in our national hobby of polishing our halos. It is ridiculous. Hopefully Ukraine will be a wake-up call, might knock us out of some of this insanity, this wokery, this climate change claptrap. It is absolutely crazy. Great to talk to you again, Jason.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.